Welcome to another mentoring moment with Dr. Mo. I'm Dr. Mo, and in this mentoring moment, we will elevate and enhance your tapping practice by taking a deep dive into reframes and cognitive shifts in clinical EFT. So, reframes and cognitive shifts are both characterized by a shift in perspective or a different way of relating to a certain subject, situation, event, or issue. But there are some major differences between the two and how you use them in clinical practice. So, let's jump right in by starting with reframes. Reframes offer a different perspective or a different way of relating to an issue. But reframes are what you can consider an external infusion because reframes are practitioner generated and do not come from the client. Since reframes come from the practitioner, they are dependent on the practitioner's own assessment of the situation and what they feel could accelerate the client's processing or shift the client into a more positive or neutral state of mind concerning their issue. And practitioners can often see, the big picture view of what is going on with a client. And since practitioners are often more removed from a client's issues than the client themselves, they could potentially offer a more impartial view of an issue through the use of reframes. But there are some challenges to using reframes. Reframes can potentially create a hierarchy in which the practitioner is seen as the one who knows what is best for the client and what specific insight is to be gleaned from a situation. And reframes are sometimes tricky to execute successfully because the client may not have the same perspective as the practitioner, and therefore a reframe may not fully resonate with the client. Reframes can be powerful, don't get me wrong, but if a client is not ready for a reframe, or if a reframe is inappropriately timed or phrased, this could potentially result in quickly losing client rapport. Inappropriate reframes could lead to a client feeling upset, invalidated, or just not feeling heard by their practitioner because the reframe does not adequately describe how they as a client truly feel or how they would like to feel. So furthermore, inappropriately used reframes could lead to clients feeling like the practitioner is trying to force them to feel or force them to view a situation in a certain way. It's kind of like pushing them into the deep end before they are ready. Okay. And so I often see reframes when practitioners are encouraging clients to forgive or let go or accept a certain situation or person. I very strongly recommend from using these concepts and bringing these concepts of forgiveness or acceptance in a reframe or even in a session in general, unless the client specifically mentions that that is something that they want to be able to do or they want to work on. And I recommend this because EFT attempts to bring a client to indifference or neutrality. And for some, this may not include forgiving someone or accepting another person. Emotional freedom for some may simply mean being able to move forward with a sense of indifference about what happened and no longer thinking about it. And so my point in saying all this is that emotional freedom looks different for every single person. And I really strongly recommend that practitioners steer clear of these types of reframes that include forgiveness, letting go, or accepting a person, situation, or issue. Okay. So my suggestions for the use of reframes is to use your intuition and to use a reframe at the appropriate time. And for me, I believe that when the suds are really low on a certain issue or event, that is the appropriate time or most appropriate time to introduce a reframe. And also, I do recommend using language that the client would probably use and go in the direction that you can see the client leaning toward as the session has been progressing. And you can use that to inform what you phrase your reframe as. And I do recommend those low suds because this indicates that there is less intensity around an issue and your client may be more open to another viewpoint when the intensity is quite low. So in summary, reframes are practitioner generated and they do not come from the client. And as you have seen, reframes are very beneficial, but they can also be somewhat tricky to execute. Reframes are advanced techniques and should be approached with caution. So if you are a beginning practitioner, I would not incorporate these into your skill set until you have advanced in your knowledge of EFT and your facilitation of the techniques. And personally, I do not use them much in clinical practice as they can easily ruin client rapport and client trust. So, in summary, use reframes wisely, and when in doubt, just simply allow the techniques to do their job. Because if you work the techniques will work. So that leads me to cognitive shifts. And in contrast to reframes, cognitive shifts are inside jobs. They come organically from the client without any external insight from the practitioner. And cognitive shifts are my favorite because as a practitioner, you simply allow the techniques to work. Because if you thoroughly tap, your client will have these shifts organically. And in my opinion, organically self-generated truths are very empowering and have far more reaching effects for clients than anything else. Cognitive shifts can appear at any time during a session, and they can describe profound client truths or simple client truths, but both profound or simple are extremely powerful, and one does not weigh the other in significance. And so I'd like to give you some examples of what you might see and what characterizes a somewhat deeper end of a cognitive shift, or on the spectrum. These can be considered more profound, overarching, cognitive shifts. So, for example, my mom did not show up to my baseball games, but that does not mean that I was unlovable. She was just a busy single mom. Or this experience shaped my future, and I can see how it relates to my whole life. I'm actually grateful for it. Or I realized that this happened for me and not to me. It was supposed to happen that way, right? So those are more on the deeper, spectrum of what you can potentially see with cognitive shifts. But you can also see some kind of more simple truths. But these do not, make them any less meaningful. So some cognitive shifts like this can show up as, I don't really care anymore. I'm actually kind of over it. Or I was scared, but now I feel like I can do it. I have done harder things before. Or that experience was really awful, but I feel like I can actually move on now. So I go over these examples of simple and profound because processing looks different for each client. But regardless of the depth of the cognitive shift, the presence of a cognitive shift in a session shows that your client is moving toward their own definition of emotional freedom. And that's a really good thing. So when tapping, your client may show evidence of a cognitive shift, but it does not mean that you should stop tapping on an issue or consider that issue resolved. And so this leads me to two divisions of cognitive shifts that I have witnessed in my own clinical practice. So this is by no means clinical EFT terminology for this phenomenon that I'm seeing, but I just thought I would include it in this video to give you some context. So, partial cognitive shifts versus full or embodied cognitive shifts. And let's start off with partial cognitive shifts. So, what partial cognitive shifts describe is that state of mind when your client is beginning to see things a bit differently, but the issue or the event you are working on is not completely resolved yet. Some intensity still remains. So you can think of this type of cognitive shift as a little spark before the full ignition. And an example about this, to describe this, is, I know my friend loves me and was doing the best they could, so I have some compassion, but I'm still angry at them for saying that to me. So do you kind of notice how there is a partial cognitive shift happening here, but there's also some residual emotional aspects that are still lingering. So there is the beginning of a cognitive shift, but there probably are some lingering suds for certain aspects that haven't yet been resolved, and that's contributing to some lingering intensity. Okay, but silver lining is that you can take these partial cognitive shifts as a positive sign because they show that your client is in the process of rewiring their neural circuits and they're starting to see things with a new light. but more tapping is needed to reduce any remaining SUD levels on certain aspects. Maybe then, after doing this tapping, your client will be able to have a full or embodied cognitive shift, whether it's profound or simple or something in between. So that leads us to a full cognitive shift. I also call this an embodied cognitive shift. And this represents when all the SUDs are zeros for an event or an experience and there is a cognitive shift. So using the same example as before, a full cognitive shift would look something like, I actually know my friend did the best they could. I really feel indifferent about all this now. I'm not mad anymore. And when I think about it, I don't feel angry. It's a zero. So, as you remember in the partial cognitive shift example, the client was in the beginning stages of rewiring their neural circuits and had a breakthrough moment, but was still angry. So, after more tapping, however, the cognitive shift became embodied and fully formed, and therefore it was integrated throughout the client's body and brain. So, I invite you to assume the role of a gentle skeptic in your work and become curious if the cognitive shifts that you are seeing in practice are partial or full ones, using your SUDs and testing methods as a way to help you facilitate this. So let's do a little recap. Reframes come from the practitioner and come with some challenges, such as the potential for losing client rapport if done incorrectly. Cognitive shifts, on the other hand, they come from the client themselves and will happen if you just trust the techniques. So I hope that you have enjoyed this mentoring moment with Dr. Mo. I'm Dr. Mo, and we will talk and tap soon.